Hi everyone, and welcome back to another devlog for my indie retro RPG. In the last devlog, I got the basic battle screen up and running. The player and enemies would load, and the player had health, energy, and mana, along with a hotbar of abilities to use. It's great that the player can use abilities to attack, but in order to truly flesh out and test the battle system, I need the enemies to fight back. So in this devlog, I'll take you through what I've done in regards to enemy AI and the challenges I've encountered. The first thing I did was about as simple as it gets. I made a couple test enemies, and I gave each enemy 3 abilities. The AI, if you could call it that, simply consisted of each enemy having an attack timer. When the attack timer expired, they'd roll a random number. Depending on what the number was, the enemy would use one of 3 attacks. Obviously, this isn't very good AI. It doesn't take into account what the player's doing or any other context around it. However, what this simple system did was let me get the basic functionality of having enemies use abilities. I got their cast bars working and made sure that the abilities were properly targeting and hitting the player. With that basic functionality out of the way, I turned my attention to making the artificial intelligence a little more intelligent. I spent some time watching videos about different AI methods like behavior trees and state machines. Eventually, I settled on a pretty simple rule-based AI system, where each enemy is assigned a class. Every class has a different set of 3 abilities, and every class pays attention to different parts of the battle and follows certain rules. For example, I have what I call the Damage Caster class. Even though it has caster in the name, it's what I'm using for any enemy whose sole role in battle is to deal damage to the player. All 3 abilities for a Damage Caster are damage abilities. So, for example, a melee enemy of this class might have a quick low damage attack, a heavy slow attack, and a medium attack that also does some kind of a debuff or damage over time. The damage caster watches the player's health and uses different abilities depending on how healthy the player is. For instance, if the player is full health and doesn't have a debuff, the damage caster will use a medium attack with a debuff. If the player's health is low, the damage caster will use the slow strong attack to try and finish the player off. The next class is one I called Healer and Buffer. The name is pretty self-explanatory. This enemy's abilities consist of 1 basic damage attack, 1 heal, and 1 buff. This enemy pays attention to the other enemies on the battle screen. If an enemy needs a buff, he casts it. If an enemy's low on health, the healer and buffer will use a heal to save it. If no enemies need buffing or healing, then this class will focus on the player with its basic attack. Another class is the Dodder and Debuffer. As the name explains, this enemy has abilities that consist of a basic attack, a damage over time ability, and a debuff. This enemy class watches the player and what debuffs or dots it has, and if the player isn't affected by a particular dot or debuff, the enemy class will use those abilities and then fall back on its basic attack. Finally, I have what I call the Support enemy class. Similar to the healer and buffer, this enemy class watches the other enemies. If the player casts a damage over time or a debuff on an enemy, the support class enemy will cure the dot or remove the debuff. This enemy class also watches the player and will try to remove any buffs that the player uses on himself. Now, this AI system certainly isn't complex, but I'm finding it enjoyable to both play and build with. I like that it gives some flexibility in that I can assign different abilities to different enemies of the same class. For instance, a damage caster who's a fire wizard might have a quick fireball, a fire blast that lowers the fire resistance of the target, and a hard-hitting meteor spell. Another damage caster who's, let's say, an orc grunt might have 3 simple melee attacks that do low damage and debuff armor. However, both will follow the same rules of engagement and how they watch the player and respond, so it has a level of predictability that the player can learn and respond to. From a game development point of view, I like that I have these sorts of building blocks that I can use to make encounters. Instead of individual enemies that all behave in complex different ways, I have these sorts of templates that follow structured rules so I can make encounters that consist of certain enemies, like, say, a support, a damage caster, and a healer and buffer, or 2 damage casters and a dodder and debuffer. Each combination might need to be approached in a slightly different way by the player or demand the use of different abilities. I'm continuing to fiddle with the AI as I develop the game, but I think this will be the core system. One small twist I've added is the concept of a skill ceiling to enemies. Basically, this is a way that I can make enemies more or less competent in battle. For example, a fully competent healer and buffer will always use its heal when another enemy gets to X% health. However, by lowering the enemy healer's skill ceiling, I can make it so that I won't cast the heal 100% of the time, instead maybe using a damage attack on the player. One fun side effect of this idea of a skill ceiling is it gives me the opportunity to add in player abilities to affect the skill ceiling of enemies. So a spell like Stupefy that might make an enemy dumber and less likely to use its more powerful abilities when it should, or a Confuse ability that will greatly lower an enemy's skill ceiling, so its decisions will be much more random. Alright, that's it for now on the AI. In the next video, I'll go through the various types of abilities I've come up with and how I've coded them to work mostly correctly. Like and subscribe if you want to see future devlogs. Thanks for watching.